Well, the mother of a cladding campaigner who died earlier this year has spoken of her loss and her sense of duty to carry on her daughter's work.
Yes, Amanda Walker lived in a flat which needed fire safety improvements, but due to a loophole in the law, she wasn't eligible for financial help.
Well, her family says the stress and anxiety this caused contributed to her death. Our reporter Phil Hendry went to speak to her mum, Glenda.
Amanda Walker's family say they'll miss her deeply this Christmas. Little could they have known when she bought this one-bedroom flat in South London in 2018, the stress and anxiety it would cause would lead to her death.
It's devastating. It's just a quagmire now. It's just chaos.
Amanda's flat had been built with flammable cladding. She became a campaigner.
It's so unjust. I've done nothing wrong and it's destroyed my life already.
Amanda was very eloquent and she wrote beautifully. She was the sort of girl that always got A's in English and things like that. And she wrote so many letters, as did I. And we always got the statutory response that it wasn't just not helpful, but they didn't know, I think, you know. I'm sort of saying, but do you not realise there are loopholes? Do you not realise there are still over 1 million people in this situation? And they would then write me sort of rather platitudinous letters. I think Amanda used to say that we were both a bit too polite sometimes, you know.
Eventually, the government did fund cladding removal. There was new legislation, but legal loopholes meant Amanda still faced huge costs.
All the amendments that would have protected us, one by one, they all got kicked out. And when we became non-qualifying, it's like there's just this black chasm ahead.
She did start to drink, there's no question. I'm not ashamed for her for that, because it was her way of, as she used the term, seeking oblivion.
Her family sought help. Amanda spent time in hospital. Psychiatrists were clear, cladding issues the cause of her anxiety, and she was given antidepressants.
I don't think that did her any good. I think she was over-medicated. I think her head was all over the place. And she wasn't. She kept saying, I am not depressed, I'm angry. You know, and it was almost within the family a joke. Could Amanda go for 5 minutes without saying the word cladding? It was just always there. And I think it had taken over her life, really. The day before she died, we were travelling up to London. It was raining and the weather was awful. And I was trying to phone the hospital and say, you know, she's, you know, it's getting serious. We desperately hoped she had actually relaxed and had a good night's sleep, you know.
Had it been a concern to you that this might be the outcome at some point in the months leading up to it? Had you considered the possibility that she might take her own life?
She had talked about it. Amanda had talked about it.
A recent inquest recorded a verdict of death by misadventure.
Can you understand the despair, the helplessness?
I've seen it so often. I'm different from Anne. She felt despair, she was dramatic, she felt anxiety. She wanted to know, she wanted justice. I think she just lost faith in the government completely.
The new Labour government says it will explore all options to end what it calls the nightmare of living in unsafe buildings. Despite having its exterior cladding replaced, Amanda's flat still has interior fire safety defects. Her parents are trying to sell, but they or any buyer remain financially liable for these unless the law changes.
We go through grief and everything else, and I think perhaps now the anger's getting in there a bit.
So with Amanda no longer here to speak out, her mother says she's reluctantly telling her story.
I, for her sake, would love to think that she had caused some small change, perhaps.
Phil Hendry with that report. Let's speak to construction lawyer Sue Ryan, who joins us this morning. Sue, good morning to you, and thanks for getting up bright and early on a Sunday morning to speak to us.
Good morning.
A heartbreaking story. How often do you hear that from the clients that you deal with?
It's a frequent issue. Obviously, there are many, many thousands of people affected by this, and there are all sorts of means of trying to resolve it, but it's all terribly complicated, notwithstanding the new legislation that's been brought in.
And just I mean, the issue here, I mean, it's 7 years since Grenfell, since it was promised that things would be done to do remedial work on hundreds and hundreds of buildings. It took a long time to move the goalposts here and there, and now there's just explain what needs to be done and what the issue is, so that people who don't live in these buildings can understand.
Well, there are two key issues, really. There's the cladding, which hits the news more than the other issue, which is the internal defects, which we've just heard about in the VT. But both types of defects are incredibly complex to remediate, and they require huge resource from expert fire engineers, from architects, and from the contractors and specialist cladding contractors out there in order to carry out the remediation of buildings. It's not simply a question of saying, we just need to take that outer cladding off and put something different on, because it's the whole external wall system that has to be remediated. And that can actually take, a couple of years on a building because of the very complex nature of those external wall systems.
So in your view, what's fundamentally slowing things down is a shortage of skilled labourers who can complete the work rather than funding per se?
I think it's a combination of two things, because there are two sort of streams of funding, if you like. There's the government funding, which is picking up the pieces where the responsible developers or landlords aren't dealing with it. And then there's the developer cohort, which is also remediating buildings for which it's responsible. But there is a huge lack of resource, particularly with fire engineering experts, and also those with experience of doing cladding works. There are a number of sort of ways that this is looking at being addressed. But for example, the government has suggested in its latest remediation acceleration plan that it may allow cladders to be put on the list of occupations where companies can bring resource from out of the UK into the UK in order to ensure that those works can be undertaken. But because of the change brought about by the legislation that we heard about, there's a new body responsible for ensuring that all of these remediation schemes are done in such a way that they will solve the problems. And that's within the ambit of the building safety regulator. And there is nowhere near enough qualified and competent fire engineers to operate that regime. So that, there are a number of different issues causing the delays.
Excuse me.
You're all right. Sorry, Nina just had a quick cough.
Sorry, Sue.
Sue, just a final one, really briefly, if you can. There's been some talk about having some kind of a nationalised approach to this, some kind of a national contractor organisation, albeit temporarily, to get this done, because, as we've heard, the emotional and the mental stress on people who are living in these buildings is huge. Do you think that would be a good idea?
Personally, I don't, because I think the issue is we haven't got the competent people or the adequate resource in the country to undertake the works. Developers are in large part doing their best to remediate the buildings for which they're responsible, but the whole process is very complicated and long and drawn out. And I don't think that just having one organisation responsible for it is going to make any difference, because you can't magic that resource out of the air if it's sort of done centrally by the government. Who's going to pay for that when the developers at the moment are doing the remediation at their own cost?
OK, Sue Ryan, construction litigation lawyer, thank you so much for your time this morning and for outlining the issues blocking remediation.
If you're suffering distress or despair, if you need support, if that affects you, there's a list of organisations which can offer help on the BBC Action Line. There's the address, bbc.co.uk/action line. Or you can call for free to hear recorded information. The number there is 0800 066 066.